Greetings, fellow painters! Today as we paint up the zombie version of Scarlet Witch for the Marvel Zombies board game, we're going to mix green in with the red midtone color of her costume to create a sexy brown shadow color for all of her garments. We're also going to explore mixing a light green with the red to create a natural looking highlight for the clothing that avoids the usual pink highlight pitfall. Welcome to Trehane Miniatures. I really like bold pyrrole red for the main color of Scarlet Witch's clothing. It's nice and bright, and I find that it paints over black primer better than other bright reds. However, I want to differentiate this zombie model from the superhero version of Scarlet Witch that I painted earlier, so I'm going to mix green by Monument Hobbies in with the red to create a dark brown shadow color that will serve as the base layer for all of her red clothing. This brown will give the finished miniature a dingier look than the vibrant purple shadow color that I created for superhero Scarlet Witch. I have the paint thinned a little with water so that it will dry somewhat translucent and give us a nice dark shadow color in the recesses. I will paint this dark brown over the entirety of the cape, as well as her gloves, her bodysuit, and boots. So much of this model consists of just this one red color that it makes painting it a breeze. The only red item that I'm not going to paint along with all of the others is her headpiece, also known as her wimple. This is because I want the headpiece to have a metallic finish to it, so I'm going to take a different approach to painting it than I do with the other fabrics of her costume. For the secondary shadow layer, I'll add more bold pyrrole red to the existing brown mix. I'm not adding any more green to this, and I want to have more bold pyrrole red than brown in this mix. This will result in a dark red hue that will be our first transition color from the dark brown shadow. I will thin this with some water as I always do and apply it over most of the previously painted brown layer. I will avoid painting over brown in the deepest folds of the cape and the downward facing parts of her boots and gloves. And I won't allow the paint to run into the seams in her bodysuit. When painting next to an area that I want to remain brown, I will begin the stroke next to the brown and finish at a point on the garment that will eventually be bright red. The thin paint will allow this to create a nice transition between layers, and I could build the intensity of this layer with a second coat that covers less area than the first. Next, we're going to start to shape our highlights using pure bold pyrrole red. This midtone color will be focused on the upward and outward facing parts of each feature of the model, as well as any prominent folds in the cape. I'm working within the borders of the previous dark red layer, and I'll follow the same approach to applying the paint as I did when I painted the dark red over the brown. Meaning I'll do my best to draw my strokes in a single direction from the darker area to the lighter area. I'm going to leave plenty of the dark red layer visible, as this is a key transition to the darker shadows. That being said, bold pyrrole red is the main color of Scarlet Witch's outfit, and more surface area of these garments will be this color than any of the other layers. On some of the flatter surfaces, like her bustier, I'm starting to create some texture with some stippling brush strokes. I'm not focusing too heavily on this at the moment, since this will get more attention with the highlights. We're going to mix bright pale green into the pyrrole red to create our highlight color. This will be the brightest highlight for the cape. I'll highlight the prominent folds of the cape and upward facing areas around Scarlet Witch's head and shoulders using short strokes that are drawn perpendicular to the length of the folds to create some texture and interest on the cape. I will also edge highlight the cape, though with this step I'm not concerned with creating texture because of how fine the edge highlight is. For the rest of her clothing, I'm going to continue with the texture technique, where I apply a bunch of short strokes, tightly spaced and running parallel to each other over the surface of the feature that I'm highlighting. I'm covering a relatively small surface area with this highlight so that the material still reads as red. I'm going to really build up the brightness on certain features, such as the center of her left eye, top of her breasts, and the top side of both forearms. I'm also going to build in some extra detail to the model by defining her abs. The boots, bustier, and gloves will also receive an edge highlight with this color. We're going to mix ice yellow with the bold pyrrole red for the final highlight on Scarlet Witch's bodysuit. I want the material of her gloves, bustier, and boots to appear shinier than the cape. I envision the material being a shiny leather, whereas I imagine the cape to be a more traditional fabric. I'll mix more ice yellow than red into this mixture so that it is very bright. I prefer to have this color appear a little yellow rather than being too pink. I'm going to work within the pre-established highlights and only brighten the most obvious highlight locations. I'm going to build up the highlights on the center of her left thigh. I'll hit the top center of each breast, and I'll increase the intensity of the highlights on the very top of the gloves running the length of her forearm. I will sometimes go in with a very thin mix of pure pyrrole red to re-establish the bright red color of her garments where I may have overdone the highlights. Then I can always use some ice yellow to dot in some final bright spots. With the red clothes complete, most of our work is done and it's all smooth sailing from here. We'll move on to Scarlet Witch's tights by using some dark plum to base coat her upper thighs, upper chest, and shoulders. This is going to be the darkest shadow color for these areas that are going to end up being pink. There are some blisters on her right thigh and chest that are growing right out of the pink material, and some rips on her left thigh. I'm going to ignore these for now and paint them as if they're part of the pink garment. I'll go back over those with the appropriate colors later. We'll create a secondary shadow color by mixing magenta into the dark plum. You probably know the drill by now. We want the dark plum to be our darkest shadow color, so we will work within the dark plum layer, making sure not to color all of it. When applying this secondary shadow color adjacent to an area we want to remain dark plum, we will draw our strokes from the dark area and finish at a point that will eventually be our brightest highlight. For example, we want the back of the thigh to remain dark, so we'll draw our strokes from the side of the thigh to the top center of the thigh that will get the brightest highlights. Then we'll do the same for the upper chest and shoulders. Pure magenta will make up the midtone color for Scarlet Witch's tights. This will be applied in the same manner as the previous shadow color. We'll work within the previous layer, covering most but not all of it, and we'll want our strokes to begin near the shadow and finish at a highlight location of each feature. This is most important on her thighs because of the relatively large surface area there. This technique is a bit harder to achieve on the smaller areas like her upper chest, but we'll persevere. We'll add ice yellow to the magenta to create our highlight color. These highlights will cover a very limited amount of real estate, much like the highlights for the red garments. The focus for these highlights will be Scarlet Witch's upper right hip, the center of both thighs, her upper chest, and the top center of each delt. I'm applying these highlights with short lines and some stippling to add texture. I have the mix thinned with water, and I'll build up the intensity of the highlights over a few passes. I'll work each coat across all features that I want to highlight before returning to the start to add an additional layer. Each highlight layer that I add will be a little smaller than the previous layer. I'm using Whole Red by Vallejo as the base coat for Zombie Scarlet Witch's rotting flesh. Her face is the only feature that is going to get the full zombie flesh treatment, but I'm also painting the Whole Red into all of the rips and tears found on her ribcage and legs. Oh, and I also use this to color the sole of her left boot. Before continuing with the face, I decide to coat Scarlet Witch's eyeballs with titanium white. I don't normally use white when painting eyes, but later I'm going to glaze over them with a translucent red so that it looks like they're glowing. After the eyes, I decide to use the whole red that is already on my palette to start work on the Wimple. I'm painting this directly over the black primer, and I'm intentionally going to leave some areas black. The black will be just right of center on the headband and in front of each ear. This is slightly different than the approach I used on the hero version of Scarlet Witch, where I first base coated the entire headpiece with German camo black brown. In fact, every step in the process of painting this mini so far has differed from how I painted the hero version. Even though all of the midtone colors of her outfit are identical, I want to make sure that this finished product looks unique when compared to the previous model. I will finish this coat with a very watered down whole red to glaze over the black areas to tie it all together. Continuing with the Wimple, we use bold pyrrole red for the main color of the headpiece. I want this to look like red painted metal, so there will be more red area here than dark or light areas. Therefore, the Pyrrole Red will cover much of the whole red. I will still use this thinned with water and draw the strokes from the edge of the shadow color towards the highlight so that we get a smooth transition from the darkest parts to the highlights. I also want to edge highlight the headpiece even next to the darkest sections. Also, I'm applying the Pyrrole Red to the full width of the bands on the headpiece and letting it fade into the dark areas along the length of the band. We'll mix some ice yellow into the Pyrrole Red to add edge highlights and highlight small areas within the existing Pyrrole Red layer. It's kind of pink, so we'll apply this sparingly. Then we'll switch to pure ice yellow to add the final brightest highlights. We'll place these above Scarlet Witch's right eye, the center of the headband, and any upward facing edges, as well as the inner edges near her cheeks. I will occasionally glaze in some Pyrrole Red to reduce the size of the highlights if I get too carried away. Sulfide ochre is used to base coat all of the interior wounds of Scarlet Witch, like the blisters, subcutaneous fatty tissue, and ribs. Then we'll use it to paint all of the blisters on her legs and chest. I'll use Glistening Blood by the Army Painter to glaze over these blisters. Glistening Blood is translucent enough that it doesn't require being thinned to a glaze consistency in order to get the glaze effect. On Scarlet Witch's open wounds, I'll be more generous with the application and fill the area around her ribs and meaty bits. Then I'll once again break out the sulfide ochre to highlight the blisters. I'm not going to take the highlights any further than this. I'll finish up her eyes with the simple glaze of Glistening Blood, and don't overlook applying some Glistening Blood to the inside of her mouth like I did. I didn't catch it until I finished painting the final flesh color. Speaking of the final flesh color, we're going to use Skeleton Bone by the Army Painter to add a few highlights to the ribcage before moving on to the face. Fortunately, the face is textured enough with all of its deformities that applying the skeleton bone is super easy. I'm using a lightly loaded brush and just dragging it across the textured surface, kind of like dry brushing. I have a little more paint on the brush than if I was dry brushing, allowing it to flow off the brush more easily. Finally, I'll use some ice yellow to highlight the tip of Scarlet Witch's nose, her right cheek, and her chin. I'm using German Camo Black Brown as the base for her hair. I'm not worried about getting black brown into every recess in her hair, since a black primer will make a fine extreme shadow color. The hair is the only feature of Zombie Scarlet Witch that I'm painting identical to the hero version. From here, we'll use orange brown model color as the first highlight for her hair. Normally, I like to highlight hair in a horizontal ring pattern starting with a halo at the top of the head, but since her hair is flowing straight back from her face instead of falling naturally around her shoulders, I'm going to highlight the hair with a vertical ring pattern. Beginning with the ring surrounding her face, we'll use a heavy dry brush approach to apply the highlights. The brush is loaded slightly more than with dry brushing, and we'll use the side of the brush to catch the raised strands of hair following the ring pattern around her face. Then we'll do this again for the end of the strands. We can also highlight a little central area on top of her head. Jumping straight to ice yellow for the final highlight, we will apply this highlight in the same way as the orange brown. We'll follow the same two rings of light, but we'll focus these highlights just in the center of the orange brown highlights. The base is painted super fast with 3 simple dry brush steps. First, I lay down a heavy layer of Necromancer Cloak by the Army Painter. I'm not trying to cover all of the black primer here, but I do make sure to cover any of the stray paint marks from previous steps. Then I do a heavy dry brush of uniform gray focusing on the upward and outward facing bits. This will act as the main color for the stone base. Finally, I complete the base by highlighting with a light dry brush of ash gray focused mostly on the rubble around the front outer edge of the base. And this wraps up painting Zombie Scarlet Witch for the Marvel Zombies board game. You can continue your Marvel Zombies painting journey with this playlist here, or check out this video. Thank you so much for watching. Please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel to join our growing community of painters.